we were talking about what you thought about the edited version of, or sorry, the digitalised version of the film, and one of your concerns was that the build-up to it was not going to get over because it's a film.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the build-up to it?
If you look at the film, you get the impression that someone turned up there, lots of arrangements, all very well planned, and some people might think it would have taken a few days to do. But that couldn't be further from the truth. This filming took place on the 14th of December 1960. And at the time, I was supervising editor at the Australian Broadcasting Commission in Victoria. But I directed 10, 15 documentaries, films that is. And I first heard about Operation Crowflight and the U-2 aircraft late November, when ABC were invited to send a director to RAAF Sale, which is about 100 miles east of Melbourne. First of all, to discuss the making of a film about the U-2 aircraft and Operation Crowflight in particular. Now, at that time, ABC had not employed any film directors, but by this time they had taken on one whose name was Louis Matley, who was originally Swiss, and he was very competent, and he went off to Sale to discuss the making of the film. And he had worked out a shooting schedule over a week at least, and had written a full script. However, about the second week in December, the ABC were informed, the producer, that's Gerald Lyons, was informed by the American Air Force that they had been ordered back to the United States, and that if they wanted to make a film, they could have Tuesday, which rather stunned the ABC. As a result, there was a meeting. Head cameraman, Les Handy, myself as supervising film editor, the studio manager, John Cameron, the film manager, Kip Fortius, the librarian, Newitt Wade, and Louis Matley. Well, when Louis Matley found out that he couldn't use his shooting schedule and had to do it in a day, he fell about. He almost broke into tears. And John Cameron said to him, "Would you like to leave the meeting?" And he said yes. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And I don't blame him. He'd spent weeks working it all out, and he had this wonderful schedule, and now they wanted him to do it in a day. So after he'd gone, studio manager says to me, "Could you do it?" And I said, "Well, I was a newsreel man the whole day to do that. Yes, I'll do it." Knowing the pitfalls, which happens when you have a one-day schedule, and so I picked a team. I picked a newsreel cameraman, Kirby Rickard, and the sound man was Don Corder, who had built his own 16mm tape recorder, and Keith Taylor as assistant cameraman. We took 2 cameras down there. We sent a 3rd camera down there a few days before, which was to be taken up by one of the aircraft to do some air-to-ground shots. And we set off from the studio in the dark. And on the Tuesday morning, we arrived at RAAF Sale about 7:30 in the morning. It was still a bit dark. And the first news we had was that there weren't any U-2 aircraft there. They were all up in the air, 3 of them. The next thing we heard was that the DC-3 that were being offered to shoot air-to-air from had gone off down the Australian Bight on a air-sea rescue mission and was not likely to be back that day. So it wasn't a bad start, I suppose. The third problem was we had a radio microphone which had an antenna, and Don Calder and Keith Taylor tried to set up this antenna to record, and they couldn't get a thing. Finally, after a few swear words, Don picked it up and threw it, and we got perfect sound. So from then on, we obtained perfect sound by throwing the antenna any way it wanted to go. So it was necessary, under the circumstances, to shoot what we could and not to wait around for what might happen later on. So the first people we could get hold of was the medical officer, Captain Ryan, and one of the pilots dressed up in, well, what we all thought was a spacesuit. And it really was a spacesuit, I suppose. And the doctor explained how these suits were made to measure, and therefore the pilots had to be on a very strict diet so they didn't outgrow them in any way. They actually kept the pilot alive. Otherwise they wouldn't last they would last seconds at 60,000 feet without that suit. So we then interviewed the commanding officer, Colonel McCaslin, and he told us a bit more about the U-2s. He made it clear all along that he never knew about the U-2 that was shot down over Russia and the capture of Gary Powers. He knew nothing of that. He thought that his 3 U-2s were the only aircraft flying. We then simulated a conversation between an incoming pilot and the commanding officer, which was routine. And then we went and had a sandwich and waited for the aircraft to come back. Well, as opposed to the slow-moving morning, everything moved rather fast in the afternoon because these aircraft were coming in. We had to film the landing, which was peculiar. We'd had it explained to us how a fast car would precede the aircraft onto the runway and then torque it down in exactly the same fashion as the present shuttle aircraft are torqued down. The reason for that is because of all the equipment and the angle it came in at. When the pilot got to the runway, he couldn't see where he was going. That's why he had to be talked down. So we shot that with 2 cameras. We put a camera in the car, recorded what was said in the car, and we then have to go back to the air-to-air shots where we didn't have the DC-3, and we asked if they had any other aircraft that could be used, and they suggested a Windgill. A Windgill was a low-wing monoplane with 2 seats, fore and aft, and no canopy. And Kirby Rickards went off with a Bell & Howell handheld camera, 100-foot loading, which is about 2 minutes 40 seconds, and took off. The pilots were aware that Kirby Rickard was going to be filming them, and they performed. I say performed in as much as they started flying around just above their stalling speed, because that was about the same maximum speed of the Windgill. But they managed to stay side by side long enough to get some very good pictures. Finally, we got all 3 aircraft down, and one of them was parked, and we did interviews with the pilot. He also handed over the camera that he had shot film from, which of course we wouldn't see for a couple of days. And Kirby Rickards, the Ace News cameraman, commandeered a Coventry Climax stacker with a pallet on board, where he set up his tripod and camera and got the driver to drive right the way around the U2 at an equal distance. So we had this perfect 360-degree picture around the U2. When that was over, we said goodbye, and it was now getting dark, and we had the 100-mile drive back. But the interesting thing was that the commanding officer was asked if that was the last of the manned flights being used for intelligence, and he said he thought it was, because from then on he would expect there would be satellites. Well, this information was to us fantastic, and we at that stage on the way back home were talking about what could happen with satellites, and almost everything else, everything we said at the time and thought of, has come to pass because of those satellites. But having said that, as far as I know, the U2s are still flying. Not the same model, but something like it. So the next task we had was to edit an 18-minute film, for which we had all day Wednesday and half of Thursday. We also had to record commentary and put titles on. And this was achieved. And on the night it was broadcast, it was an insert in a 30-minute program called People. And in the other minutes available, the commanding officer, Captain McCaslin, was Colonel McCaslin, sorry, Colonel. Colonel McCaslin was interviewed yet again. Afterwards, there was a few drinks in the green room, and the commanding officer came over to me. He says, "I'm somewhat amazed by what I've seen." He said, "We've had an army film unit working with us for 18 months, and he said they haven't produced a film yet." So I said to him, "Are you saying that this is the first film that's ever been made about the U2s?" And he said, "Yes, sir." Very satisfying.
That's where it's gone. You haven't mentioned you sure yellow top. You're getting these bloody wasps that are getting close to your neck a couple of times. So watch out for that.
They think I'm Big Brother.
I must do, yeah. Kirby Rickards in the windshield.
Oh, well, yes. So Kirby Rickards goes up in the windshield, and by now all the aircraft are being towed except the one up in the air. And so we've got nothing else to look at but Kirby Rickards on the windshield and the other remaining U2. And all of the air-to-airs were done over the airfield. And incredibly, when we looked, there was Kirby Rickard standing bolt upright in the back seat of the windshield with the camera up to his eye because he didn't want any part of the windshield in his frame, in his picture frame. And so we've got absolutely clear air-to-air shots with no windshield in it. And he was even able to reload the camera while he was up there. And I don't think anybody but a newsreel cameraman could have done that, or would have done that. Mad as a rabbit.
But you didn't capture it. We didn't have a camera to capture him.
No, we didn't have a camera with us, so that would have been priceless, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't
Picture of that.
Wouldn't it? You said that the film itself was used again in Scotland, didn't you?
Oh, yes. What happened is that one of the film editors from the ABC on my staff, with us, only 2 weeks after this event, returned to London looking for jobs, both of us. Well, after a while he got a job working with John Grierson, who was producing and presenting a programme called This Wonderful World, broadcast originally by Scottish Television, but it was networked throughout Britain. And the programme was dedicated to outstanding documentary films. Dennis got the job as film editor for that programme, so he was obliged to screen all these programmes from all around the world. And he phoned me one day and he reckoned that our film was a bit better than some of those that he'd seen, and he was going to recommend it to John Grierson, which he did. Grierson ordered a copy from the ABC. He saw it, thought it was wonderful, and I always remember how he introduced it. He said, "Surely the Germans are best at actuality, but," he said, "the Australians are not far behind." The only problem was I was English. Gerald Lyons, the producer, was English. Kirby Rickards was English. And the other two were Australian. But it was a team, and I don't know of any other team that could have done that. It all worked perfectly. And they showed a good part of it, and caused a bit of a stir when it was shown, but it did not get full recognition. I don't mean for the quality of the film, I'm talking about the contents. The contents should have been front page news, and somehow that didn't happen.
What do you suppose that was? I mean, it comes back to the other thing I was going to ask you. ABC showed it on that programme that it was meant for.
Yeah.
And sometime later it went out on John Grierson's program. Was it shown anywhere else any other time?
Don't think so.
And therefore, didn't ABC at that time realise what they got?
No.
Because that was when it should have been on front page news.
Yeah, I mean,
And been marketed or
what
something.
we were told, I don't know whether it's true or not, but on November the 2nd or thereabouts, the Americans had a presidential election, 1960, and the man elected was Kennedy. And the story was that Kennedy had ordered Operation Crowflight to stop and send them back to the States because he didn't want any U-2s up in the air. He wanted a clean slate with the Russians. That's the story we were told. If you now look at the story, especially the story as shown on the internet, the return of that Operation Crowflight's not mentioned.
Yeah.
Neither is the making of the film.
And to... Well, it doesn't exist, does it?
No. No.
And it certainly doesn't exist with ABC, it would seem. I also like the idea because when you came back to England, you worked with another organisation, didn't you?
Yeah, I rejoined British Movietone News as assignments manager, and on the first day I was given a file of the previous year's work just to familiarise myself with what sort of work they were doing and what equipment they had. So I'm flicking through and I see a reference, I think it was to RAF St Morgan, and part of the equipment was a telephoto lens, the biggest one that Movietone had got. So with the open file I walked into my new boss's office and said, "What's the telephoto lens for?" He said, "Well, that's the U2, that's at RAF." He says, "You're not allowed anywhere near that." He says, "So you have to get it through the outer wire fence with a telephoto lens." So I said, "Well, I've just shot a film on the U2. I said, I've leant against one. And I said, I've walked around one." And he says, "You couldn't." He says, "No." He said, "This is a secret aircraft." He says, "You must be talking about something else." I said, "No, it was a U2. He said, "I don't believe that." So I couldn't convince, no, I didn't try to convince anybody apart from him. And I didn't go into his office to convince him about anything. I wanted to know what the telephoto lens was for. And it wasn't until early 1962 that, it's about 14 months later that John Grierson showed it. And then he had to accept that it was the U2. Because I knew it was going to be shown, and I told him it was going to be shown, and he then looked at it. And he still couldn't understand it.